working. We don't have the lines going across. And this is to do with the way the fall off works in older versions of Cinema 4D. Let's solo our setup. And in the fall off tab, this is set to infinite by default. So let's change this to linear. And we'll get a similar looking type of fall off to what we had in version 21. Let's change the orientation from Z plus to Y so that it's pointing up and down. And I believe here it actually needs to be Y minus. The fall off also is going to be set to 100%. And now we can move this to roughly the correct point. I think it's going to be the same as what we had in 21, so -50. And if I play this through, now you see it is fixed. And just a bonus note here about why the looping is working. If I disable the bool tool just so we can see the shapes, let's go to the front view. And I'm also going to temporarily disable the plane effector. At frame 0, let's look at the position of this cube which cuts right down the center of our disk shape. And then if I scrub through to the end of the animation, you see it ends up in the same relative position. So that's what creates the seamless loop. If I wanted the whole animation to be faster, I would have to use a starting position at frame 0 for this cloner, which is what we animated, and its starting position would have to be basically lined up the same. So I could go for, let's say, -300, and I'm doing this by selecting this keyframe here and changing its value in the keyframe properties. Let's go to -300. And you see there was no visual change because that ends up in the same relative position. The difference is it's much lower than -200. So if I play this back at 300, it's going to be a faster animation, and it's still going to loop as well. Because if you put in a number which doesn't line up, the loop is going to be disrupted. So let's say -275 as an example. Now the starting position, and if we look in the center, it's not lined up compared to the end. So there would be a jump in that animation. Anyway, that's it. Let's turn this other stuff back on and move on. In this lesson, we will do the main animation, which is the car and camera animation together. And we need to set up our scene in such a way that the animation loops seamlessly. So let's jump in and see how that works. So the way looping works for a scene like this is that whatever the camera is looking at the beginning of our animation, that's what the camera needs to be looking at the end of the animation, so that when it plays through from the beginning, all the frames in between, and then plays through to the end and starts again, that should create an illusion, or the illusion of a loop. So let's see how we set that up for our particular scene. We need to select all the objects which make up the main section of the entire scene. So that's basically everything from the original landscape to the palm trees and all the objects in between. I haven't selected the car or the camera or the sun out there in the distance, just everything else. And this is going to be put into a null object, which I will call section. And let's take those objects again, place them in here. And what I want to do here is instance this entire thing. So if I, with it selected, I will go to this icon, get the instance, which once again, it just means copying it. I can move this new instance down range like this. And this needs to be set to 20,000 centimeters so that it lines up perfectly with the first section. So now, if we animate our car and camera to go from the center of the first section all the way down to the center of the second section, which is going to be 20,000 centimeters, that should create the illusion of a loop. So if I jump back into our camera I'm actually going to create a new null object. Let's call this move. It's going to be the one that moves our camera and car at the same time. So let's take our camera and car, place that in here, and this is what's going to have the actual animation. So if I move this null, you can see that it's moving the car and the camera at the same time. So at frame 0 in the coordinates, let's go to the position Z and set a keyframe. So hold Control and click to turn that red and set the keyframe. Scroll to the end of our animation and set the position here to 20,000 and then set the new position. If I look through the camera, go to Window and Timeline, we have a new object here that's animated. Let's also make sure that these two keyframes are linear. So this is the position Z on the move null object. So select the keyframes, click linear, and now this should have a constant speed throughout. If I rewind to the beginning and hit play, it's going to lag just because of how many objects we have in the scene. So we can try and improve the playback rate here, starting by temporarily disabling the atom array and their instances, because this is part of what's causing the slowdown. And also in the cloners of the palm trees, I will set the instance mode from instance to render instance. It reduces the memory footprint of those models to just as if they were one model, and it speeds up the viewport performance. So if I do that again, you can see it's a bit faster, although not at full speed yet. But for preview purposes, this is absolutely fine. Anyway, as I scroll through to the end here, you can see that parts of our scene are looping, especially anything that's near to the camera. But the sun out there, we get closer and closer to it as we travel, so that ends up jumping. So to fix that problem, we just need to go back to frame 0. Currently, the sun is at 80,000 centimeters away, so that's the sun instance. Just leave it there, but make it a child of the move null object too. And it's important to do this at frame 0 so that it maintains that same relative distance throughout. So now if I play this through, when we get to the end here, you will see it stay in the same relative position, which completes the loop for that part of the frame. Now, another issue here is that when we get to the end, at the beginning, the animation is looking through two whole sections, the original section and then the second instance section that we just created moments ago. Whereas at the end, because we have traveled through the first section entirely, at the end we are now only looking through one of the sections. So we need to extend this out further so that we make the illusion as perfect as possible. We just need to make copies of the instance. The second one I moved to 40,000 centimeters away, and the third one is going to be moved to 60,000. And I think with those three instances, that should be enough to make this loop jump imperceptible. You can still see a slight jump right on the horizon, but it's not too much of an issue, because by the time we do everything else in the scene, when we add the camera shake and all the other effects, that slight jump at the end there won't be as noticeable. And we can always just do this another time and push this out to 80,000. And the more we have lined up, the less imperceptible that jump is going to be. Anyway, that's it. That's how we would loop this particular animation. It's really just a visual trick we achieve by lining up several of these instances. Anyway, if I jump out of the camera here, so we have a God's eye view of everything, you can see the sun there is so far away that the camera is clipping and it's going out of view. If that bothers you, you can press Ctrl D to bring up the project settings and the view clipping, change it from medium to large, and the viewport is now capable of containing objects which are further away. And performance is still quite good regardless of all those objects that we have. It's just only when we try to play the animation that we have a few problems. That's just because we have so many generators and things going on that Cinema 4D needs time to calculate each frame. But if you're looking at just one frame and just, panning around like this, it's perfectly responsive enough. So as you saw there, by just lining up several instances of our original scene, we can animate through it and create a seamless loop effect. The next lesson is a bonus, and in it I show you an alternative method of refining the seamless loop effect by reducing the difference between the first frame and the last frame in our animation. This part is optional. It's not going to massively affect how your loop looks, but if you're interested in really optimizing things rather than using a brute force solution, then you might find this interesting. The main issue with the loop is that even though we have lined up 5 long instances here, there is still a slight jump just because of how the geometry is set up. So if I go to the beginning and then switch to the end, you can still see a slight jump in the palm trees in the way they are arranged. Now, it's not a massive issue, really. Like I said, you wouldn't really notice this in the final piece unless you were looking for it. But if I were to, let's say, take away the third instance, and this is something I really would want to do, because having many instances in a scene increases the size of the project, much more heavier lifting for Cinema 4D to do. And if you have a slower workstation, that could be a real problem. So instead of just throwing several instances to try and fix the issue, we can take a different approach and try to optimize the scene within our means. So I will actually completely get rid of this instance. So now I'm down to 3. The difference now between the first frame is more obvious because of that missing extra instance. But it's not a problem, because if we once again just take a look, the main object that's visible in the jump is the palm tree. The landscape itself is really not changing at frame 0 or at the end. So we are just dealing with the palm trees in this case. So what I want to do is select the palm trees, which are in the original section, and it's this cloner at the top. Let me call it cloner palm so that it's easy to identify. And I'm going to insert a plane effector that's with that cloner selected. So MoGraph effector and plane. And by default, the plane effector just moves everything up by 100 centimeters. So what I want to do is set that value to negative 1500. And I use that number because that's roughly the length of each palm tree, or the tallest of the palm trees anyway. You can just see them sticking out a bit. Then if we select this plane effector, I want to go to the fall off tab and select a linear field. Let's click this. Change the direction from X plus to Z plus instead. And now what will happen is if I move it from its original position, it's going to reveal the palm trees behind it. And this is moving the linear field itself, but really I should be moving the plane effector, the whole thing together, and it has the same effect. Let's expand the fall off distance so that this effect is more gradual instead of just popping up like this. If I click on the linear field, we just want to go to the length, and let's go for something like 5000. And this will be much more gradual of a reveal. So we want to move this all the way to the end of the animation, which I'm already at here. And let's move it to the point at which it would just be about to fall off the edge of the last instance. And I can see I moved the field again. I need to move the whole thing instead. The visual result is the same, but I just prefer to keep the objects together. So that's going to be about here somewhere. Seems to be about 65,000 in the Z position. So let's put that there. And then if I make it a child of our move null object, which is currently moving the camera and car, and make sure you do this at the last frame of the animation, place this as a child. And if I rewind this backwards, you can see that this is going to be now moving with our camera and car. And the effect of that is that if I look through the camera itself at frame 0 and at the end, because I am slowly revealing the palm trees, you will no longer see just a slight jump in the way that the palm trees are arranged, because they are slowly being revealed as we are traveling along this road at the same rate. So by using this solution, I end up with a smoother looking loop. Any apparent differences are completely gone now. And also I did that with less instance objects. So my scene is lighter and more optimized than it was prior. Simply lining these up, that's what I would describe as the brute force method, where you just throw as many objects as you can at the problem, and it does work. So I think overall this is a better solution to this particular scene, and different scenes will always require different solutions, but it's good to know as many approaches as possible. We will once again open up this project in an older version of Cinema 4D because the plane effector and fall off will be, it works a bit differently. And I just want to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So optimizing the palm trees in earlier versions of Cinema 4D is going to be very different. Let's start by turning off the plane effector, because it's just completely hiding our trees. And also, the way the cloner works in older versions of Cinema 4D is very different. So you can see all the trees are bunched up in this location. So let's go to the attributes of the cloner, and what we need to change is the total Z size. And I'm actually just going to go to the object mode here, and with my live selection, and just grab the handle to scale that cloner until it's the correct size. It's going to be somewhere close to 20,000, right? So let's start with that, except I think that will put a tree right at where the two sections meet. So we have to make this a bit smaller. But from here, I can take this and just move it manually until the spacing is correct. It ends up being about 18,600 or so for the total size. Now if I re-enable the plane effector, and let's see where it is in the scene, it seems to be way over here for some reason. I'm not sure why. If I scrub through to the end of the animation, you can see it's just completely in the wrong place. It should be way out there in the distance. So I am just going to remove this plane effector and start again. If I now select the palms and go to MoGraph effector and plane, it will once again just move all the palm trees by 100. We want to move them by negative 1500 to be below the ground. And I don't know where this object is in my viewport. So if I select it and press S, it's going to be framed, and I can find exactly where it is. And I can see it's at the 0 point of our scene. If I rewind to frame 0, that's where the car begins. So we need to set up our fall off to have the same results as we did in version 21. Let's go to the plane effector, and in the fall off tab, instead of having the linear fields set up, we have a drop down instead. So this is set to infinite. Let's change this to linear. And now we'll have a similar behavior to what we had before. Let's change the orientation to Z minus so that it's going to be revealing as it travels in that direction. The size is also controlled in X, Y, and Z. So let's set the Z size to 5,000. So it has the same length, and the reveal is going to be more gradual. And I'm also going to set the fall off to 100%. So we use the entire range of this fall off size. I want to move it to the point at which it would be about to fall off the edge of this, the last segment. It ends up being the same position as we were dealing with in version 21, so about 65,000 centimeters. And that lines up perfectly with the last segment. Now if I move my timeline marker to the end and then place this in here, if we reverse the animation now, we can see it's revealing at the same rate that our camera is moving. And we have now created the same effect we had in version 21. Anyway, that's it. That's how the cloner and plane effectors and fall off used to work in older versions of Cinema 4D. So now that we have finished building and animating our scene, we'll move on to the actual look and style of the animation, starting with the materials and shaders. Let me double click to make a new material. This is going to be our floor material. And throughout all of this, I should be looking through our camera. Let's double click that new material. Call it the road. Actually, not the floor. This is going to be black, and in the reflectance, let's disable the default specular. We are just dealing with reflections here. So let's add a reflection legacy. The roughness I would turn down all the way to 0, and specular strength do the same. The reflection strength itself is just going to be 20. We can set the attenuation to additive, and the layers blending mode, if we were combining it with the one below, we would want to set this to add, but it makes no difference in this case. Let's apply this to the road cube, which I didn't name correctly yet, so let's do that. I can place this directly or apply it onto the object in the list over here, but essentially we're doing the same thing. I will make a copy of this, and I will just make one change, which is the reflection strength. I'm going to turn down to just 10%. And this will be applied to the floor, which, if you recall, was the larger grid pattern just on the outside here. And once again, if I can just aim for it and place it down, you see it works. Or I can find it in the object list and do the same thing over there. And at this point, maybe I should enable my interactive renderer so that I can see the changes as I make them live. This is enabled by pressing the Alt key and R. And if I just expand its reach, make it a bit wider perhaps, and I will also move the quality slider all the way to the top. So now any changes I make, I can actually see what they look like in the final render itself. Right now I can see that the default light in Cinema 4D is turned on. That's why we can see anything at all. So to counter that, I am going to create a new light and just give this an intensity of 0. And that overrides any default lights which Cinema 4D tries to throw in by default. Anyway, we can continue. The next material I want to create is the one on the landscape itself. So once again, I will just make a copy of one of these materials. And in the reflectance, let's maybe push this up to about 50. Also in the luminance channel, I'm going to enable this, which is going to just make everything brighter. Okay, I haven't applied it yet, so that's why it's not making any difference. Let's call it landscape, and let's apply it to the landscape object. And anything we are doing in this first section and instance will be automatically updated in our other instances down the stretch here. So let's go to that material. Instead of just having a full-on white color, let's use a Fresnel effect. So that's found under texture and Fresnel. And what this does is it illuminates the different parts of our geometry based on the angle that the camera is looking at them. So if it's a steeper angle, you see it's brighter, but if we are facing it at more of a 90-degree angle, you see that it gets darker. And anyway, it creates this really nice looking effect. What we want to do though is jump in here, click the gradient, and let's just pull it back a touch, maybe to about halfway. Move the effect closer to the edges of our geometry, and then I'm going to change the color to about 265 on the hue slider, and then put this all the way up to 100% for the saturation. So this kind of blue/purple. It's too strong though, so let's go back to this level, and we can set the brightness to, let's say, 50. But it's being overlaid on top of white, so let's put the original white brightness down to 0, and we end up with something like this instead. And hopefully as we create more and more of these materials, you can start to see how this is going to shape up for the final look and style. Let's see what we can do next. We have these illuminated lines. So for these, we will create another material. Let's just double click anywhere. And in luminance, let's start with the yellow lines. So for the hue, that's going to be about 40 to 45, and saturation all the way up. Let's turn off any other channels. We just need the luminance channel for this one. And let's find those lines. So that's the side and center lines, which I would just drop in like this. It's also the grid lines on the floor, which I have currently disabled to speed up the performance of the scene, but we know that everything is going to work anyway because we have previewed our animation already. So we can turn those atom array lines back on. Let's apply the materials onto them. So the floor one is right here. This is going to be atom array floor, and the other one is atom array landscape. So if I click away and just give this a few seconds to process, we should see the lines on the floor there. So let's make a copy of this material and give it this kind of color, about 290 on the hue slider. And this is going to be the grid lines over the landscape. So that's the other atom array. And slowly it's starting to shape up. Next up, we have the trees, and I gave them a similar treatment to the landscape objects where we have the Fresnel effect. So if I copy the landscape material, and let's call this trees, except I'm going to remove any reflection, the Fresnel is going to be a different color. So if I jump in here, let's make this more of that 290 degrees or so for the hue slider. I will apply this onto the cloner, which contains all of the palm trees. And as soon as I do this, you will see that shading now kick in. That's it for the main materials. We do need to create the stars now that we see in the background. So for this, if I double click to create a new material, let's call this BG for background. And once again, in the luminance channel, I will disable the other channels. Let's enable luminance. If I just click this bar, this will open up the import dialog for our image. And I have this JPEG here, which just contains these stars. So we can bring this in, click no. We need to attach it to a plane and place that plane behind our sun. So if I press Alt and R, we can get a plane. And it needs to have the same ratio or dimensions as our image so that our stars don't get stretched out in either the up or sideways direction. So the orientation, first of all, needs to be Z+, so it's facing up. And then if we click on our material, I can see the resolution. This is if I click on the luminance channel, I can see the resolution is set to 4007 by 2505. So what I will do is start by giving my plane those same dimensions. So 4007 and then 2005. So that's 4 here, not 2. And if I apply that to the plane, which I will call background, let's move it past where our sun is. So that's at 80,000. Let's move this to 81,000 centimeters. And now it's somewhere way behind there. It needs to be much larger. And what I can do is the size, if I change the size here on editable objects, it automatically and proportionally changes the other size too. So if I go for, let's say, 100,000 centimeters for its X size and hit enter, you see that the Y size is automatically adjusted too. This only works down here, but you can always change them individually without affecting the other in the actual object properties too. That's clearly not large enough still. So let's change that to be, let's say, 120,000 or maybe even 125,000, basically until it's large enough to contain the entire frame. So we need to be on the first frame to line this up, and actually I think it needs to be even larger. So I've gone 440,000 here, and then here it also needs to be inside of the move null object so that it moves at the same rate as our camera and car. That way it will appear static in the distance, just like we did for the sun. Now, the material itself looks very fuzzy there. We can't really see any of the stars at all. So if we go to the editor in the material, let's change the texture preview size from default to, let's say, 2K. And we can now see the stars a bit clearer. Also, I know this image is upside down because of the orientation. It should be Z-. If we once again enable our interactive render, let's see what it looks like with the stars. In the example, the sky has a bit of a gradient to it, and also, a lot of color. Right now, it's just completely black. So let's go into the material, and in the luminance channel, let's take everything and place it inside of a layer. So that's just going to this arrow, this drop down layer, and we can open this up, go into the shaders, and let's enable a gradient shader. Let's go to the type, set this to 2DV, so it goes up and down instead of sideways. And if we create 3 handles, the first one being this kind of color here, about 290 again, basically using the same colors throughout for some consistency to the style. And then the third handle is going to be the other color, which was about 265 or so. So I think this is upside down. I should be seeing from the halfway point the transition from this color to the other color, which would go from about here to the top of the frame. So I know this is happening because the plane itself is upside down. I would change the orientation from Z+ to Z-. And in the preview, you can already see that it's going to be the correct way. I could have just rearranged the way I did these colors here, but either way, we end up where we want. Let me right click and distribute just to make sure that's right in the center. And then if I go back, place this gradient below my stars image, this bitmap, we want to set the stars blending mode from normal to, let's say, screen, and that will combine those two things together. You can now see the stars through the gradient. This needs to be a lot weaker. Let's go for about 25%. Right now it's too bright, about there. And I want to tone my stars a warmer color. Right now they are more of a white, cold color. Right click this bitmap image. I can place it inside of a filter. And if we jump in here, let's colorize this. Set the hue color to about 40 degrees, which is roughly like an orange/yellow color. And put the saturation all the way up to 100%. There is a preview here, but it's very small. You could open this up and right-click Open Window, enlarge this, and you can see the changes you do to the image in the filter. But it's almost like re-rendering this each time it you make any changes. So you would just have to give it a few seconds to process before you see any difference. Anyway, we can see the differences in the actual image itself. If I go back, I can maybe change the blending mode from screen to add. This should make it brighter. And if the stars are not bright enough for my liking, I can copy this shader, go to shader and paste, and then add this on top of the original also. And this should create a brighter stars effect. It's very subtle, and it might get lost in the quality of the video you're watching, but that was just a bit punchier than before. But that's it as far as the materials we have to create. From this point, I am just going to make some changes to the existing materials. Starting with the sun, it's simply not bright enough. So if I go to its material, that gradient we created earlier, to change its brightness, I have to go to the luminance channel, and the brightness here, if I go for, let's say, 150, you don't see any change at all yet. That's because the mix mode with our gradient should be set to multiply. And now, when I make this brighter up here, you will see a difference, and it actually updated by itself there. I will leave that there for now. We can actually adjust these colors later in After Effects anyway. Another change I will make is the material on the windows. Currently I can see through it, which I don't really like that much. I prefer this kind of dark tinted look. So I will go to the car's materials, which are in this DMC12 layer, and it's this glass material here. So we're just gonna turn off the transparency, and then in reflectance we could maybe put a slight shiny effect to that. So that's just a classic reflectance layer. Set this to add, and roughness set all the way down to 0. Same for the specular strength, and the reflection strength I will put down to about 50. Attenuation, additive, and the layer color I will throw in a Fresnel to create this kind of material. This should have the effect of just completely blacking out that window, and I like that for this particular scene. Another adjustment, you can see right now my car's white paint material is completely invisible. That's because there are no lights in the scene, or we do have a light, but if you recall, I set its intensity down to 0. So let's get another light, and this one I will set to about 25, maybe 20, and I will enable this ambient illumination switch, which applies the same level of illumination to all of the objects in the scene. And since the car's paint here is one of the few materials that has a diffuse channel in the color channel, that's where you really only see a difference. Everything else is being made up of luminescence and reflections, so it doesn't really affect much else. But now we can see the paint on our car. Furthermore, if I go to the color, let's give it that same color that we've been using up to this point, but with a saturation of only about 40% or so, just so that it's not completely white. We want to give that a slight tint to blend in with the rest of the scene, and as I do that, you see the slight change there. Okay, but that's it. That's how we create the materials and colors for our scene here. One final thing is I will point out that the lights on the back of the car here, of course, that's this red material that you see, which is just a simple red color in the luminance channel. Like, it already came pre-applied onto the car model. And if I just show you what that looks like, let me disable this interactive render and solo the car by itself. It's on the lights at the back here. If I open this up, this piece of geometry right there, and I just isolated the color to be on the actual tail lights. I think these are the brake lights here, and you've got your indicators, your reverse lights, and so on. So the middle strip here is where I applied this backlight material. if I solo just that piece of geometry, you can see how this works. I simply selected those polygons. So if I press U and F, I can select any polygons which are connected together. And I'm holding Shift to make a multiple selection. And we'll do that over here. And if I were to just quickly create a new material as a test, I can enable luminance on that. Okay, they're over here, and apply it to there. And you can see it applies to only those polygons I selected. Now, I think I had the other one selected prior to that, so it went there too. But just in case you were wondering, that's how I ended up with just that part of my rear lights illuminated. And that's what we want for this scene. So the materials and shaders are just the first step in developing the style and look of our animation. In the next lesson, we'll continue